Hello everyone. In today's lecture we will be discussing the Portuguese, Spanish, Greek and Turkish dictatorships that existed during the Cold War. Unlike the authoritarian states of Eastern Europe, the Southern European dictatorships were notable for being on the US side of the Cold War and even being members of NATO. Their existence thus challenges the dichotomy of freedom versus tyranny that is sometimes evoked when discussing Cold War Europe. Portugal was a dictatorial state run by former economics professor António Salazar. The government banned strikes and lockouts whilst expanding infrastructure and economic growth at the same time as it limited social welfare. Portugal's economy grew massively and its debt shrunk considerably. Political parties were banned and all eligible voters were encouraged to join Salazar's National Union. The dictator referred to his system of control as the new state. The new state emphasized order over freedom and attempted to neutralize society through the use of censorship, propaganda, and political imprisonment. Portugal gave heavy support to Franco in the Spanish Civil War, but was neutral in World War II, even as they allowed the British to use Portuguese naval bases in the Azores. Portugal was not allowed to join the UN until 1955, but was a founding member of NATO as early as 1949. The worldwide scope of the Cold War made Portugal's sprawling and rickety colonial empire and its system of naval bases very important. This empire, however, was rapidly disintegrating, particularly as the 1950s became the 1960s. Portuguese India was the first bloc to fall. Portugal had controlled parts of India for 450 years, including the rich territory of Goa. In 1961, India took control of this mostly Christian territory, helped by a flood of passively resistant Indians who flocked into the territory. Goa became India's smallest state shortly thereafter. In the early 1960s, violent uprisings broke out in Portuguese African colonies in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. Perhaps because of the longevity of its colonial rule in these countries, Portugal was unwilling to grant them independence, considering them to be part of the Portuguese state. Portuguese troops defeated their African opponents in battle, but were unable to wipe out the independence movements, which drew sympathy and support from around the world. Meanwhile, the wars cost Portugal millions, shattering the delicate economy that the new state had built up. In 1968, Salazar had a stroke, and he died 2 years later, leaving the new state devoid of effective leadership from above. Salazar's successor, Marcelo Caetano, would take control of Portugal as it was struck by economic chaos, an escalation in the foreign wars, and eventual revolution. In February 1974, the book Portugal and the Future was published by war hero General Antonio de Spinola. Spinola argued that the war in Africa could not be settled by military victory and advocated autonomy for the colonies and an end to Caetano's leadership. Some 200 to 300 officers, calling themselves the Armed Forces Movement, launched a coup on April 25, 1974, which came to be known for its bloodlessness as the Carnation Revolution. The new regime after the revolution abolished censorship, the paramilitary forces, and the secret police. The African colonies were granted independence, causing a refugee crisis in Portugal as Europeans fled Africa in their millions. A radical left-wing government came to power, but was then overthrown, and following a failed communist coup, democratic socialist Mario Suarez came to power. Much of Spain was in ruins in the 1940s, which were largely years of hunger and misery in the country. As refugees streamed into the run-down cities from the starving countryside, the losers of the Civil War, who survived, slipped out of view and into the margins of society. Open dissent was brutally repressed, and the media was strictly monitored. Franco sent troops to the Soviet Union, but never joined World War II. Whether this was his decision or Hitler's remains unknown. There was certainly little that Spain could give to the Germans, and Franco would have demanded French North Africa in return for his support. After the war, Spain was banned from the UN, and dissent in the country gradually increased. This dissent came not just from the left, but from the right. Monarchists clamoured for the restoration of the Spanish king. The heir to the throne, Don Juan, made word known that he would happily work with a democratic setup in Spain. The communists, meanwhile, rose up in a 4-year guerrilla war, but were massacred. Franco maintained his dictatorship by use of nationalism and support of the church. The actions of the UN in excluding Spain were useful, for example, as a means to rally nationalist support, as Spain appeared to have been victimized. In 1953, Franco signed an agreement with the US in which Washington promised to bankroll Spain in return for military bases. In 1955, Spain, like its dictatorial neighbor Portugal, was able to join the UN. By this time, the Spanish fascists in the Falange had largely been replaced in power by authoritarian and religious conservatives, including many monarchists. An economic crisis forced Spain to implement free market reforms and open up the economy to outsiders. The state withdrew a lot of the control that it once had over the economy, which caused misery for a lot of ordinary people who were forced to find work abroad. Agriculture largely collapsed as people moved to the big cities. In the 1960s, an influx of tourism allowed the economy to boom once more. As Spanish industry also picked up, workers began demanding increased rights and an end to the influence of the fascists in the workplace. Both the Basque and Catalonian regions pushed for autonomy, and terrorism broke out in the former. As Franco's health deteriorated, voices in Spain began to demand an institutional transition of power to protect the dictatorship. Force remained the guiding power in the country. The government severely repressed terrorist activity in the Basque provinces and executed 5 terrorists in September 1975 despite international protests. In the end, Franco's dictatorship lasted until his death on November 20th, 1975. The subsequent accession of Juan Carlos as king began a peaceful transition to democracy, but one which left much of the Francoist state intact to the disappointment of many Spaniards. The law for political reform was passed in November 1976, which paved the way for democratic elections. In elections held in June 1977, a coalition of centrist groups, called the Union of the Democratic Centre, surprisingly emerged as the strongest party, winning 165 seats in the Cortes, or parliament, closely followed by the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party, which captured 118 seats. This was a triumph for political moderation and consensus politics, and the far right had been trounced. A new, moderate constitution, overwhelmingly ratified in a public referendum in December 1978, established Spain as a constitutional monarchy. Hundreds of thousands of Greeks died during the Second World War to German atrocities and famine, whilst almost the entire Jewish population was murdered. The devastating civil war that broke out after the Germans were defeated further devastated the country. The 1950s were a time of massive economic growth, especially in Athens, but also brought political repression. Centrists came to power in the 1960s and promised reforms. However, a crisis in Cyprus had erupted, with the British, who had controlled the island, giving it independence rather than giving it to Greece, as Greek nationalists expected. The army grew angry, and a colonel, Georgios Papadopoulos, launched a coup, initiating a period of military rule. The colonels, as the military junta came to be known, misruled Greece from 1967 to 1974. After a failed counter-coup in December 1967, the Greek king was forced into exile, with Papadopoulos assuming the role of regent. In 1973, the monarchy was abolished entirely and Greece was declared a republic. In reality, it remained a military dictatorship. The Greek dictatorship was condemned by liberals and socialists throughout Europe. Following student protests, which were violently suppressed in 1973, Papadopoulos himself was overthrown from within the junta and replaced by the even more repressive General Dimitrios Ioannidis, the head of the much-feared military police. The great expansion of Soviet power in the post-war years exposed Turkey in June 1945 to Soviet demands for control over the straits connecting the Black Sea with the Aegean and for the giving of territory in eastern Anatolia. This pressure caused Turkey to seek and receive US assistance. US military aid under the Truman Doctrine begun in 1947, providing the basis for a large and continuing flow of military aid, and economic assistance and reconstruction begun in 1948. Meanwhile, a growing class of professional and commercial men demanded more freedom in the country. The Allied victory in the war had made democracy more fashionable. Accordingly, the government made concessions, allowing for new political parties, universal suffrage, and direct elections. The Turkish liberals, who dominated politics in the 50s, were committed to a program of economic growth to be achieved through a reduction of state interference. At first they had much success, assisted by good harvests and by an economic boom caused by the Korean War. A collapsing economy toward the end of the decade, however, caused the government to adopt increasingly authoritarian and Islamist measures, and in 1960 the military launched a coup. The Turkish military, wished to end the repression of the government, not to seize power for itself. It stayed in power only long enough to restore order and a moderate constitution before leaving. Violence between Turks and Kurds in eastern Turkey brought the military to once more take control of the country in 1971, this time ruling by martial law for 2 whole years. Although military rule was violent, the military once more limited the power of the extremist civilian parties. The extremist parties, however, came out dominant once more after the army retreated from politics in 1973, and political violence in 70s and 80s Turkey was common. Meanwhile, Greece and Turkey began an increasingly bitter dispute over oil in the Aegean Sea, despite the fact that both countries were NATO partners. General Ioannidis, seeking a nationalist triumph, launched a coup to depose the president of Cyprus and incorporate the island into Greece. The president survived, but the coup triggered the invasion of the northern part of the island by Turkey. The Turkish army occupied 2/5 of the land area of Cyprus, despite the fact that the Turkish population consisted of less than 20% of the total. Ioannidis responded to the Turkish invasion by mobilizing for war with Turkey, despite the fact, again, that both countries were meant to be NATO allies. This mobilization proved to be chaotic, and the regime, bitterly unpopular domestically and totally isolated diplomatically, collapsed. North Cyprus, meanwhile, remains a rump state to this day, dependent on Turkish aid to survive. To conclude, modern democracy has fairly recent and shallow roots in Portugal, Spain, and Greece, despite the fact that the latter was home to both classical democracy as well as to the word itself. Political and business leaders in the US, as well as France, the UK, and West Germany, were all happy to work with the dictatorships, so long as they kept order and kept the communists out of power. Meanwhile, thousands of political prisoners in southern Europe were murdered or imprisoned for daring to seek the same rights of freedom and liberty that NATO claimed to protect.